have the absolute pleasure of introducing Dr. Shawnita Sealy-Jefferson today to speak with us at our CCTST Grand Rounds. Dr. Shawnita Sealy-Jefferson is a social epidemiologist whose primary research seeks action to combat manifestations of structural racism that limit the human rights of Black families and communities. And I'm not going to go and read her credentials or tout the accolades that's listed on her CV, although they are, without question, academically impressive. I want to highlight the work into which Dr. Sealy-Jefferson has committed her career, and I might actually jump as far as saying her soul, as I personally view the work that she does as soul for work. Dr. Sealy-Jefferson is the founder, director, and principal investigator of the Social Epidemiology to Eliminate Disparities, or SEED Lab. The mission of the SEED Lab is to conduct high-quality epidemiologic research to find solutions to the disproportionate burden of infant mortality among Black women. The goal of the scholarship that emanates from her lab is to inform future intervention studies, policy change, and social activism. To this end, Dr. Sealy-Jefferson is the principal investigator of the Social Epidemiology to Combat Unjust Residential Evictions, or the SECURE study, funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. In partnership with the Community Advisory Board of Black Women Leaders, the SECURE study will document for the first time the magnitude and severity of court-ordered and illegal residential evictions, as well as their impact on the health of Black families in the Metro Detroit, Michigan area. This mixed methodology multi-level study will prioritize community power and agency and center the voices, experiences, and ways of knowing of Black women. One of the many qualities held by Dr. Sealy-Jefferson that I personally have admired is that her work is unapologetic and filled with honesty and hope. The SECURE study is specifically for us, by us, and grounded in the fact that housing is a human right and Black lives matter. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Sealy-Jefferson.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I always have to restrain my tears when people are talking about me and what I'm trying to do. I really appreciate the kindness, and thank you all to all of you who are here. I look forward to our discussion. I want to acknowledge that I am occupying the traditional homelands that were stolen from the Meskwaki or the Red Earth people. This statement is one small part of disrupting and dismantling colonial structures and pervasive revisionist history. I also understand that gender identity is not binary, and my reference to women throughout this talk is in keeping with the original self-identification of the study participants in the data sets that I use. So first things first, my identities absolutely inform my work. I am a Black mother, a partner, a Black woman, a partner, and a mother. I'm a highly sensitive INFJ. I'm a Detroiter, a proud Detroiter, and a first-gen college student. I don't get to choose between scholarship and activism. I have to do both. So I am in the academy, and my primary allegiance is to the liberation of my community. I also trust myself and my ancestral memories and various ways of knowing. So I want to start with an overview of what I plan to talk about. First, I want to talk about some theories and frameworks that I use to guide my thinking on the problems that my work seeks solutions for, specifically preterm birth and racial inequity. I'll then give you some examples from our work that is social epidemiology focused on neighborhoods and preterm birth. And then I'll talk a little bit about the SECURE study, and then I'll look forward to our discussion at the end. So I want to start with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was a comprehensive body of law that details the rights of individuals and the responsibilities of government to protect those rights. First of all, we are all born free and equal. Everyone is entitled to these rights, no matter your race, religion, sex, language, or nationality. Everyone has the right to freedom, life, liberty, and safety. And I've highlighted the human rights that have particular relevance to housing, which is what the bulk of my current research is focused on, including you have the right to leisure and rest from work. Everyone has the right to an adequate standard of living for themselves and their family. We are all entitled to social order in which we may enjoy these rights, and you have the right to social security and are entitled to economic, social, and cultural help from your government. Now I want to talk about reproductive justice, which was coined in Chicago in June of 1994 by the Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice. This framework combines reproductive rights and social justice. It's based on the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights that I just talked about. It's defined as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, to have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. Reproductive justice is based on the three interconnected sets of human rights that I just talked about. So this is the choices. So we understand that reproductive justice is not about choice, but about access, because the choices that people make are a function of the choices that they have. And it's focused on all reproductive rights, not just abortion. So that includes contraception, comprehensive sex education, sexually transmitted infections, prevention and care, alternative birth options, adequate prenatal and pregnancy care, domestic violence assistance, adequate wages to support our families, safe homes, and more. And a reproductive justice analysis draws attention to the ways in which the history of white supremacy operates in a capitalistic system to affect the present reproductive lives of individuals and communities. So now let's talk about intersectionality, which helps illustrate for us how racial and gender oppression interact in the lives of Black women. And because the beneficiaries of my scholar activism are self-identified Black women, and I understand that gender identity is more expansive than a binary, I want to just situate this conversation in this intersectional framework that was defined by Kimberly Crenshaw. So this framework helps us to understand the interconnections, specifically how gender is structured through race and class, and how Black women specifically are targeted for multiple simultaneous oppression. So these interconnections are important not only as they influence individual identity and experience, but also as the systems themselves are entangled, co-constructed, and mutually dependent. The driving purpose behind an intersectional framework has always been to examine how best to shift systems of power, not just how best to understand or describe these systems. And only when we imagine the intersection of race and gender can we imagine the needs and perspectives of Black women and people, rather than focusing on what's immediate and proximal and easy to measure. An intersectional framework is a holistic approach that helps us to ask the right questions and to find the right solution. Now let's talk about fundamental cause theory, which was articulated by Lincoln Phelan originally in 1995, and it was developed to help to explain why the association between socioeconomic status and mortality has persisted over centuries, despite radical changes in the diseases and the risk factors that have been presumed to explain this association. Fundamental cause theory helps us to understand the cause of the causes, or the risk of the risk. An important implication of fundamental cause theory is that health inequalities resulting from fundamental causes cannot be eradicated by addressing intervening mechanisms, because there are enduring inequalities in knowledge, money, power, prestige, as well as beneficial social connections that ensure that these mechanisms are reliably replaced. Fundamental causes have four essential features. The first is that they influence multiple disease outcomes. They affect these outcomes through multiple risk factors. They involve access to resources that can be used to avoid risks or minimize the consequences of disease. And these relationships are reproduced over time through the replacement of intervening mechanisms. So the long-term impact of a fundamental cause can only be eliminated by reducing inequalities in flexible resources. So now, just so that we're all on the same page, I want to talk about systems of oppression, which include all of the isms, so racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, ableism, etc. These are systemic and directional power relationships among social groups in which one group benefits at the expense of other groups. These systems are multiple and interlocking, and their interaction is complex rather than simply additive. So whereas this systems of oppression model that I just talked about identifies the scale at which oppression operates. So it operates among individuals who are embedded in institutions and permeating cultures. This five faces of oppression model helps describe for us qualitatively how oppression operates. So there's 5 phases. The first is exploitation, which refers to the systematic transfer of resources from one group to another. Then marginalization is the prevention or limitation of full participation in society through exclusion from, for instance, the job market, healthcare system, public benefits programs, or community activities. And then powerlessness, which is the deprivation of the ability to make decisions about one's living or working conditions. And then cultural imperialism is the valuing and enforcement of the dominant group's culture, norms, and characteristics. And then violence, including physical, sexual, and emotional violence, and the threat of violence, as well as policies and structures that condone violence. It's important for me to note that some manifestations of oppression could be understood in terms of more than one of these phases, and there's no hierarchy of oppression. Some of these systems manifest in some ways that are similar and in some ways that are different from each other. What we see here in this table is that across various social determinants and adverse health outcomes, people from the global majority compared to white people are made vulnerable and experience disadvantage in multiple ways, with Black people doing worse than the other racial ethnic groups for most of these. So we can look at wealth, we can look at poverty, we can look at infant mortality, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about. No matter what we look at, we see these stark and persistent inequities in social conditions and in health in the United States over time. Compared to other industrialized nations, the United States ranks poorly in terms of infant mortality. This figure is showing you infant mortality rate data over time from 1915 to 2017, and this is, you see in the black line is everybody together. Then we have the rate for white people over time, Black people over time, and then we see the Black-white ratio is what I want to draw your attention to. So the most stunning piece of this figure is just, I just want to talk about that for a little bit. In 1916, Black mothers were 87% more likely than white mothers to bury their babies before their first birthday. And in 2017, Black mothers were 122% more likely to bury their babies before their first birthday than white mothers. 1916, 87%, 2017, 122% more likely. This data tells me something very specific, that every public health intervention, every research investment, everything that has been tried didn't work at the population level. Nothing worked because the root cause of these racial inequities has not been addressed. That's the only way that this data makes sense. In order to understand and make sense of these stark and persistent and disgusting inequities in poor health and early mortality among Black communities, I argue that historical context is key. Here I'm showing a timeline of the history of Black people in this country, with 1619 marking the first record of African chattel slavery here. From 1619 to 1964 was 345 years of inhumane treatment, poor health status, and inferior or absent medical care for Black people. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was less than 60 years ago now, and it was supposed to end segregation in public places and ban employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And we have evidence that this legislation did not do what it was created to do. From the Civil Rights Act of 1964 till now, only represents 14% of the history of Black people in this country. And this historical context, as well as unequal starting points, have health impacts across generations, because the history of Black people in this country is unlike that of any other racial or ethnic group. And this history matters for the current population levels of adverse health that we see. So our understanding of adverse health outcomes at the population level by race ethnicity has evolved. It started with this idea that these inequities are racialized expressions of biology, in which the average biological differences between members of diverse racial and ethnic groups are assumed to reflect some innate, genetically predetermined differences. That's been disproven conclusively. And now we understand that these are biological expressions of racism, because this reflects the lived experiences of enduring racism. It's literally how people embody and biologically express experiences of social and economic inequality from before they're born to the day they die. And this produces social inequalities in health across a wide spectrum of outcomes, like we've already just talked about. So then it's racism, not race. Race is a social rather than biologic construct. It refers to social groups that share cultural heritage and ancestry. It's justified by ideology in which one group benefits from dominating other groups. The identity of the dominant group is tied to this position of domination, and this is based on selective and arbitrary physical characteristics. And again, there's large and enduring associations with health and mortality across race and inequities. And this is not new. W.E.B. Du Bois was talking about this in the 1800s. And racism then is the institutional and individual practices that create and reinforce oppressive systems of race relations. So Dr. Kamara Phyllis-Jones articulated for us these three levels of racism: institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized. This picture of this iceberg represents acts of racism. The tip of the iceberg represents acts of racism that can be seen, like the state-sanctioned murder of 7-year-old Aiyana Stanley Jones on the east side of Detroit in 2010, or the countless other people. The portion of the iceberg that lies below the water represents structural racism, which is more dangerous and harder to eliminate. Structural racism is the macro level systems, social forces, institutions, ideologies, and processes that interact with one another to generate and reinforce inequities among racial and ethnic groups. Policies and interventions that change the iceberg tip will not eliminate the effects, as we've seen with this example of infant mortality rates over time. To be sure, structural mechanisms do not need the actions or the intentions of people to be effective. So even if interpersonal discrimination was completely eliminated, we would still see racial inequities in health, and they would persist like they've persisted for over 100 years. So systemic racism is a fundamental cause of racial inequities in health. Lincoln Phelan re-articulated this theory in 2015 to add systemic racism as a fundamental cause, because born from the economic advantages of slavery for white people when this country was founded, all of the major institutions have been pervaded by racial stereotypes, ideas, emotions, and practices. Socioeconomic conditions that undergird systemic racism are reliably reproduced over time. And this embodies a set of flexible resources that advantage white people, like structural factors such as dominating the major government and commercial institutions, including elected and appointed government offices at the national, state, and local levels, educational institutions, the penal and legal systems, mass media, real estate, banking, medicine, entertainment, the list goes on and on. Also, individual resources like money, knowledge, power, and prestige, beneficial social connections, which are held disproportionately by white people, and social psychological advantages like expectations that white people should dominate, beliefs that white people are superior, and desires for social distance from non-white people. And the broad range and flexibility of the resources that racism provides white people facilitates the reproduction of socioeconomic inequalities by race. So this shows that systemic racism influences flexible resources through multiple replaceable mechanisms, which in turn affect racial differences in health through multiple replaceable mechanisms. This is a fundamental cause of health inequality. Some of these resources, like income, are an inherent part of socioeconomic status, but others, like some neighborhood conditions, are not. And a large portion of racial differences in health outcomes are attributable to racial differences in socioeconomic status, and the authors show that racial differences in flexible resources and socioeconomic status are related, but they do not completely overlap. So there's been much scholarship that has established multiple pathways by which racism harms health, including adverse physical, social, and economic exposures, as well as maladaptive coping behaviors and stereotype threats. Usually these things are acting concurrently, These exposures can accumulate over the life course and across generations, and several of these have impacts on one's ability to acquire and keep safe and sustainable housing, especially state-sanctioned violence and alienation from property and traditional homeland. So now I want to talk about the data that I use to document some of these associations between macrosocial determinants of population health. I've used life course influences on fetal environments or the life study. The original intent of this study was to quantify whether and how racism is related to preterm birth in Black women. We have a cohort of about 1,400 Black women. It's a retrospective cohort. Data were collected between 2009 and 2011. And we have surveys, medical records, current and prior addresses for our participants, and they were eligible to participate if they delivered a singleton birth at a suburban hospital. And they were recruited in the immediate postpartum period. So after they delivered their babies, but before they were discharged from the hospital, they completed the study material. So preterm birth, just to orient us, is birth before 37 completed weeks of gestation. It's a multifactorial syndrome. It's the second leading cause of infant death overall. And infant mortality is the metric that we use to gauge overall population health. It's linked to adverse adult health outcomes. So the outcome of your birth dictates your later chronic disease risk. And then again, there's stark and persistent and disgusting racial inequities in preterm birth. So why I started was we had these surveys, and we were interested in whether women's perceptions of their residential environment is related to preterm birth rates among Black women. And what we found is that the relationship between women's perception of the neighborhood walkability, food availability, safety, and social disorder was related to preterm birth, but only among women with lower levels of socioeconomic status as proxied by educational attainment. And we saw no similar associations for women who had higher levels of education. So these relationships were in the expected direction, suggesting that women who had lower socioeconomic status, their perceptions of their neighborhood seem to be predictive of their risk of preterm birth rate. From here, we were interested in, okay, so of these four associations we found, how do they operate? So we shifted to hypotheses about how these associations operate, and we thought psychosocial factors might mediate these relationships. So we looked at the potential mediating effect of perceived stress, psychological distress, as well as depressive symptoms. And we found that the relationship between women's perception of the neighborhood safety and its impact on preterm birth might operate through depressive symptoms. And then there was a direct association between women's perceptions of their neighborhood disorder and preterm birth. And this was net of the influence through any of the three psychosocial factors that we examined. Then we switched gears. We were initially focused on subjective neighborhood measures, and then we created a neighborhood disadvantage index from 9 optimally weighted socio-demographic factors from the American Community Survey. And we thought that the relationship between this neighborhood disadvantage index and preterm birth might be different depending on religious coping for Black women, because we know that this group uses religious coping to deal with chronic stressors like neighborhood poverty, and because we know that religiosity has been conceptualized as a social determinant of health, we hypothesized that this association might be different by religious coping. And we had 3 domains of religious coping: organizational, which was how frequently you go to church or places of worship; non-organizational religiosity was how frequently you pray for yourself or ask other people for prayer; and then subjective religiosity was how satisfied the women were with relationships with people they had from their church or place of worship. And we found that the relationship between neighborhood disadvantage and preterm birth was modified by non-organizational religious coping, specifically asking other people for prayer. So those who lived in highly disadvantaged neighborhoods and infrequently asked other people for prayer had nearly 30% higher risk of preterm birth. And this suggests that non-organizational religious coping might buffer against the influences of living in a neighborhood with high socio-demographic disadvantage for Black women. And then because we know that exposures across the life course matter for health. We were interested in whether the relationship between current perceptions of stress and preterm birth rates were modified by perceptions of early neighborhood social disorder and social control. We adapted a valid and reliable measure of adult neighborhood context to refer specifically to the neighborhoods that our study participants lived in when they were 10 years old. And we found no strong evidence of a relationship between women's perceptions of stress in the past 30 days and preterm birth in the overall sample. But among women who reported high early life neighborhood social disorder and high perceptions of stress in the past 30 days, this was associated with preterm birth, and we didn't see similar associations between perceived stress and preterm birth among the women who reported low early life neighborhood social disorder. So this work suggests that early life neighborhood context might magnify the association between current perceptions of stress and preterm birth in Black women. And then contextually, because we know the foreclosure crisis altered the social fabric of many neighborhoods in the United States in ways that might be connected to stress and preterm birth risk, we were interested in whether living in a neighborhood with high tax foreclosures was associated with preterm birth in Black women. And we again thought that this relationship might be different by educational attainment based on our prior research. So we found that neighborhoods that had high tax foreclosures, women who lived in neighborhoods with high tax foreclosures and who had high levels of educational attainment seemed to be protected from preterm birth in this sample. And this also suggested that educational attainment might be offering some advantages to Black women that buffer against living in a neighborhood that has high tax foreclosures, which is a proxy for abandoned property, crime, and decreased community resources, as well as blight. And then we shifted to neighborhood level mass incarceration and was interested in the impact of living in a neighborhood impacted by this manifestation of structural racism and whether it was related to preterm birth. We know that the United States has the largest proportion of residents in jail or prison globally. From 1978 to 2009, the number of people in federal and state prisons increased 430%. And we know that about 50% of Black women have an imprisoned relative compared to about 12% of their white counterparts. So in neighborhoods with elevated incarceration rates also have poor population health indicators like asthma, higher rates of asthma, sexually transmitted infections, as well as psychiatric morbidity. And what we found is that the average prison admission costs in the neighborhoods that our study participants lived in were tenfold higher than average. And we found little evidence of an association in the overall sample with living in a neighborhood with high mass incarceration measures and future preterm birth risk in Black women. But we found that marital status and maternal age at birth both modified the relationship between several measures of mass incarceration and future preterm birth risk. So what we had, we have prior addresses for our study participants, and luckily I was able to link neighborhood level mass incarceration rates from the Justice Atlas of Sentencing and Corrections for the year 2008. So this data only available for the year 2008, which is not accidental. So luckily we were able to make this data linkage, but this also highlights the fact that mass incarceration is a reflector and a participator in structuring racial inequities in health in the United States. So now I want to talk about evictions. What I'm showing you in the figure is that a comparison of eviction rates over time. So we see the rates for Michigan compared to the United States from the year 2000 to the year 2016. The rates in Michigan have been consistently higher than they have in the overall country. Residential evictions are the most harmful source of housing instability. We know that many people pay more than 50% of their income in rent and utilities, and 1 in 4 renting families pays more than 70% of their income in rent and utilities. Only 25% of families who qualify for affordable housing assistance actually receive it. Eviction is among the most understudied issue affecting urban minoritized residents and results in financial hardship, insecurity, powerlessness, depression, even suicide. So what I'm talking about are court ordered or formal evictions. We know that this impacts 2.3 million low-income renters per year. Poor women of color have the highest risk. We know that formal evictions are landlord-initiated forced moves, and this is impacting so many people before the pandemic, and during this pandemic, it's only been exacerbated. Matthew Desmond, who pioneered the study of evictions in society, said that eviction is to Black women what mass incarceration is to Black men. Both of these things are a cause and a consequence of poverty. We know that Black mothers, as well as those who are victims of domestic and interpersonal violence, bear the greatest burden of formal court-ordered evictions, which suggests that there are racial, family, and gender discrimination, that there is this happening by landlords. And we don't have any data on how frequently illegal evictions. So any eviction that doesn't go through the court is illegal. These include strong arm lockouts and unofficial orders for the tenant to vacate a rental property. And estimates suggest that illegal evictions happen about 50% of the time because they are significantly less expensive and more efficient for landlords than court-ordered evictions. So from this, we were interested in whether living in a neighborhood that has high evictions is related to preterm birth in Black women, and whether marital or cohabiting status is a modifier. So in the overall sample, we found neighborhood eviction filings and judgments did not predict preterm birth, which is not different from what we've been finding in all of our other neighborhood effects on preterm birth work, but the associations were modified by marital or cohabiting status. Specifically among women who were married to or living with the father of their baby, those who lived in neighborhoods with high eviction filings and high eviction judgments had higher risk of preterm birth than women who did not. And we found little evidence of an association for women who were not married or living with the father of their baby. So this work led us to Secure Study. So this study Secure stands for Social Epidemiology to Combat Unjust Residential Eviction. And whenever I talk about Secure Study, I always start with this quote from St. Zora Neale Hurston. In 1937, she wrote, "If you're silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it." Secure Study is a mixed method, community-based participatory research project for action. We're including Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb counties in Michigan. We're quantifying the magnitude and severity of court-ordered and illegal evictions and how they impact the health of Black women, families, and communities. We have two projects, one focused on court-ordered evictions. We are using some secondary data analysis from the life study and linking neighborhood eviction rates over time and to the data from the life study to see changes in neighborhood evictions over time and how they matter for Black women's maternal and birth outcomes. And then we have the qualitative pieces. We're doing focus groups in the 3 counties to get women's experiences living in neighborhoods where they see other people being evicted. And then the illegal eviction piece of Secure Study, we are fielding the study. We're in data collection mode right now. We're recruiting Black women from these 3 counties to complete a survey. And then we haven't started this yet, but we'll be doing in-depth interviews with Black women who themselves experience illegal eviction. So we have Black women stakeholders from various sectors and community-based organizations. I'm also funding Black women consultants to co-create the work. I always say this because it's kind of stunning that the original budget for this $1 million grant was slated to go 71% of it from my institution to funding my students' education, paying Black women consultants, and funding equitably compensating Black women for their contributions to science, and paying them in U.S. dollars for their contributions and for sharing their stories with us. So we are quantifying the magnitude and severity of court-ordered and illegal evictions in a groundbreaking way, and we center the voices and experiences of Black women, families, and communities. The project is for us, by us. It's grounded in social movement principles, and our work with the Community Advisory Board will speed translation of the findings into action, including social activism, advocacy for housing affordability, and increased federal spending for housing assistance. The results of this project will fill an important gap in the current public health literature and discourse by focusing on an understudied yet highly prevalent and policy relevant social determinant of health. This is a picture from our website with the Community Advisory Board members. Not everybody is on here. Some people are like, no, I don't want my face on a website, but like are definitely out here doing the work, recruiting, talking to people, telling them what is at stake. And then I wanted to just leave us with this quote from Professor John H. Gracie, a distinguished historian. He offers a provocative analysis of the devastating economic, political, and social effects of racism on white people. Professor Gracie says, racism is not free for anybody. His work is a departure from analyses of racism that have focused primarily on white power and privilege, and he focuses on the high price that white people, especially those who are in the working class, have paid and will pay for more than 2 centuries of divisive race-based policies and attitudes. His central point is that failing to acknowledge the centrality of racism to the American project not only minimizes the suffering of Black people, but also blinds us to how white people have been harmed as well. Professor Gracie says the payoff for white supremacy is the clientele for the payoff for white supremacy is getting smaller and smaller. All of us, in one way or another, pay the price for what has and is happening to Black people. And the failure of this nation to deal with this in the past and the present has consequences for all of us. He says that racism distorts reality. There's a mythology that tries to make racism something that happens elsewhere. And this robs you of understanding your relationship to the history of racism and racism's present manifestation. This mythology disarms you and your ability to function in the world with the antagonism that you see before you. His analysis is in hopes that at some point there will be more joint action to correct the situation, indeed because our shared liberation is at stake. So I want to end with some acknowledgments. I want to honor the sacrifice, the contribution of the life study participants who trusted us with their data for the sake of finding solutions to various violations of our humanity. Same for the secure study participants. And I want to acknowledge my seed lab and my co-authors, my secure study research team, and our funders. The National Institutes of Health funded this work twice, and then this current project, Secure Study, is funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I want to thank you all so much for your attention. And I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sealy-Jefferson, for such an incredible, inspiring, and profound talk. I really appreciate that. I know that our audience will likely have some questions, and so I'm going to give them an opportunity to kind of pull their thoughts together while I go ahead and just ask you some questions that I may have. In terms of your secure study, what is your most surprising finding to date?
Thank you for that question. We're in data collection mode. I haven't done any of the analyses yet. I'll give you a couple things. The first thing is that in our focus group, one of our participants was describing, the question was something like, what do you have to do to get through being evicted? And how do you do it? And what about the kids? And she said something that took the breath out of we were on Zoom. It took the breath out of the Zoom room. She said, your kids never really get over being evicted. She said, my kids still talk about what they lost when we were evicted 6 years ago. And I knew that. I was like, I need to quantify the impact of this on Black women, families, and communities, but just the real grief of this mother who had rebounded, had gotten stable housing, her kids were older now. She said they still talk about what they lost. And it just, I grossly underestimated how atrocious this primary data collection would be. I say all the time, like, I see why people don't do this kind of work, because it's so gut wrenching. It's it is it is there's no words to describe it. I also have been shocked because I'm doing so much of the outreach. Every single Black woman who participates in Secure Study gets on Zoom and talks to me. So, like, if I could share, I'm not going to share, but if I could share my Google Calendar, which is what I use, I have so many meetings. I've met hundreds of Black women, and so many of them say, when they see me, when they get on Zoom and they see me, they say, a lot of them say, "Oh, I wasn't expecting to see you. I thought this was a scam." So many people tell me they think a research study that's for Black women by Black women, in which Black women will invest 1 hour of work with, and then they will get an equitable exchange for that work of $50 US. They think that's a scam. Why would it be a scam that Black women would be equitably compensated for their contributions to science? That's stunning to me. So I would just point to those two things: is that the horror of this problem, I grossly underestimated. And that's been one of the most shocking things. And I've been having to have a very intentional self-care, self-soothing, secondary, dealing with like the secondary trauma, vicariously experienced trauma, because I'm holding space for us and bearing witness to the violations of our humanity and our human rights. So that's what I would say about that.
Thank you for sharing that. You every so often post some of the more profound comments that are made on Twitter, and they are equally as horrifying. But I'm going to also add that there's a lot of hope in those comments as well, and it kind of brings me to the next thing I want to say. And again, I want to let the audience know, if and when you have questions, just raise your hand. We will allow you to go ahead and speak. Otherwise, it just might be a conversation between Dr. Sealy-Jefferson and me. One of the things that I wanted to notice that I feel that your work does beautifully is really it allows everyone to understand the importance of having full representation of research participants. And I say that in the sense of, we spend a lot of our time simply ensuring that we have an appropriate proportion of participants that meet a specific racial categories. And we don't really dive into and we do this, and we spend a lot of time scratching at the surface trying to get people to participate to meet those criteria. And the struggle to get people to participate is, a lot of it is not just all of the barriers that we put up, it's also the untrustworthiness of the system that has been built around individuals who want to participate. And what you've done is you've created a research system that focuses on individuals, that show the world that individuals do want to participate in research, and they want to participate in research that's meaningful to them. And we as researchers are very poor at understanding what's meaningful to them. And I wanted to make that comment because it has, listening to your work and sort of following you through, has allowed me to open up myself to say, we have to be better at understanding what people want us to do, and not just do what we think we want to do or what we think needs to be done, because we usually don't really know that either. What would be your advice or your first steps? Oh, I'm going to stop there before I finish because I see a hand up. Ms. Smith, Dr. Smith?
Yeah, hi, thank you. Amazing job. So I remember when you were talking about it, you were on the website page, but you talked about it throughout of how you plan on turning all of this into advocacy, and if you have like you're in the data collection phase, but what your thoughts are in terms of how you imagine turning this back around, and being able to um, yeah, give back to your research participants.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Hey, Michaela. Thank you. I don't know what I'm going to find, but I know it's going to be discussed. So I would imagine, and also, I'm like my advocacy isn't waiting until I get the data in and can analyze the data. Like so there was a new tenant organization, Detroit Tenant Association, new organization just founded because the tenants in this part of the country aren't organized. So landlords are doing the most atrocious things to people in broad daylight, and there's no consequences. So what? So I heard about this rally that they were going to have. I went right down there to the rally. I had secure study flyers. Somebody said, "Oh, we didn't know you were coming, but can you talk?" I said, "Yeah, give me a microphone. I'll talk." So like, I'm in the community. I'm like I said, I'm in the community that my work is in service of, and I'm in the academy, and my allegiance is not to the academy. My allegiance is to the liberation of my community. So I don't get to decide that advocacy will wait until the data is done. I'm finding ways. I'm connected to community-based orgs. I'm finding ways to support people who are participating in my study, or people who are facing evictions. We've done court support for people who are facing evictions. If you sit in eviction court, because a lot of it is online, it's atrocious. It's full of Black women with children, and unfortunately, the way that some of these judges treat these tenants, it is astounding. So what do? I just type in the chat. This is white supremacy. This is racist. Y'all don't see this? I'm trying to use whatever privilege I have for the benefit of people who have less or no privilege. And I can't do everything. I'm a researcher. I'm not a community organizer. But if I can be in these community organizing spaces and encourage the people who are out here doing the work and find ways to embed them into the research enterprise if I can, and if they want to, and pay them for their contributions to this research, and like there's a thousand ways that the advocacy can be happening concurrently with the data collection. And I can't do everything. I mean, like I said, I'm meeting every single one of my study participants so that I can verify their identity, because I have people signing up for secure study who are in China, who are physically in China. So I make everybody get on Zoom, turn your video on. If I don't see a Black woman, you are not participating. And then I get to personally thank each and every one of them for helping me get the data, get the evidence about what's happening to us out here. I'll tell you, one of the things that I'm imagining is some direct action, some direct advocacy. We are meeting with city council members. They are in similar circles as us. Like I'm connected with these community-based orgs and going to their meetings and finding ways that I can leverage my position and power to support their causes. But I can imagine some work around holding landlords accountable. That would be something, even before I analyze this data, just hearing some of the things that Black women are experiencing from landlords, that's something that can be done immediately. Like, hold landlords accountable. Actually, our elected officials need to do their job. They need to ensure housing as a human right for everybody. Every single human should have housing. So like, these are two things: landlords being held accountable, elected officials do their job. And we don't have any data, right? So like right now, people are saying, we don't have any evidence that that's a problem, because no data, no problem. So I see me collecting this data is advocacy. This is going to be used for the next study and the intervention and the policy change. But the data is the first step. Like, we don't have the data, people can say that's not a problem. So I have a more expansive view of activism, of action, of telling the truth about what's happening. Like, saying what this is. This is not people's poor choice. This is a structural, institutional problem that's rooted in white supremacist ideology, and we need to call it that. Mincing words doesn't help us.
That's great. Thank you so much.
I see Danny McBride.
Hi, I just wanted to
Hey,
say thank you, Dr. Sealy-Jefferson. I first got to know her work from Twitter. So if you guys have Twitter, and if you don't have Twitter, I highly recommend getting an account. I just dropped her username in the chat because as an epidemiologist postdoc, it's just so useful and encouraging to see an epidemiologist who's doing community work for the community with the community and utilizing all the powers that the academy brings to support the community, because so often we see that grant money doesn't necessarily go straight to the community. So your statistics on just the amount of money that's empowering Black women in the community is just really amazing. So thank you for being such a good example and for speaking really hard things like the data that you share. Like, it's really hard to hear, but if it's not recorded, like, there's no action to be taken and policy change. So yeah, thank you for sharing today. And thank you to the
thank you.
CCTSC for hosting.
Thank you so much, Dr. McBride. I wanna say that that's very kind. And I'm so glad that like my presence and like how I'm doing my work and how I'm trying to be thoughtful and intentional about the work is inspiring to the next generation of leaders. And I just want to, I would be remiss if I didn't say, you have to expect opposition. Okay. The way I am and how I do my work does not endear me to a lot of people in academia. Okay. I get a lot of pushback, a lot. Like if I chronicle the pushback, you would be aghast. But expect it. Because I get that constant. It's like constant. Okay. I'm constantly battling. And then these women are on Zoom sobbing. They're like, thank you for thinking of this. Thank you for I didn't know I was gonna meet you. I saw your Facebook ad. I saw you in a video. I didn't know I was gonna meet you. You're doing a lot. I see you out here doing a lot. And that's worth it to me. Okay. When once the cure study is done, that's not it. This is a movement. Okay. We think every human should have housing. So that's what we're fighting for. I'll also say, do not ever put your dignity on the table. Okay? You got to be principled. Don't back down. Don't put your dignity on the table, because what's going to happen, that's where your power is. You put that on the table and you walk away from the table, somebody's going to pick it up and you'll never get it again.
Thanks
We
for
got to
sharing
feel
that.
more.
I have a
We have to
follow-up
feel more.
question to that. I hear like you express that sentiment about pushback a lot, and I see like a lot of people doing similar work express that sentiment. And as a new, graduate, can you give like examples of pushback? I think everyone on this call like sees the importance of your work, and I just like what pushback do people give?
Oh, how much time do you have? Oh, you don't have that much time. Let me just give you a very, very real, tangible example, okay?
Yeah,
I got a
thank
$1
you.
million grant. I have a $1 million grant, okay? September 2020, my project started. The pandemic was raging, okay? I was like, I'm convening my community advisory board, but it's going to be virtual, okay? I'm not going to be able to put everybody in a room because the pandemic is killing people. So my program officer said, why don't you just get creative? Figure out a way to like simulate an in-person meeting, but do it on Zoom. And I was like, okay, cool. So I'm going to buy $10 Starbucks gift cards virtual for all of my community advisory board members. And I'm gonna email them the gift card, then they can go get their Starbucks and their breakfast sandwich and come back home, and we can have a Zoom meeting, and I can simulate an in-person meeting. Do you know what happened? This was a $200 spend request on a $1 million grant, and I had to fight my institution for months. They said, you can't do that. You cannot do that. And I was like, that doesn't make sense. I have money in my budget for food. This is me thinking outside the box. I want to spend $200 of $1 million grant to do this. And they said no. And I said, you don't tell me no. I'm going to buy it, and y'all are going to give me my money back. And it was like, no. For months. It took months for me to get a $200 reimbursement for $10 Starbucks gift card to send to my community advisory board. I had to get the funder involved.
Wow, thanks for sharing that. I'm sure that's just, a small example of many, but it's helpful to hear like, logistical institutional things that deter your work. So thanks.
Absolutely. You're welcome. It definitely, it deters the work, and it also points to the difference between words and action. Okay. So sometimes institutions say, we value this. But then logistically, the system isn't set up for that. And there's a lot of people along the way who are empowered to tell me what I can and cannot do, who don't do research, which is a problem. These are institutional issues that need to be worked out. So if you value community-based work, the system needs to be set up to encourage the innovation necessary to do the work. And in my experience, that has been the challenge. And nobody's going to stop me.
There is one last question in the chat, and I honestly don't know that you're going to have time to answer this, but it was, how can institutions better facilitate work from researchers like you and ensure that byproducts of research actually go back to community members?
Thank you. That's such a good question. Oh, hey, Mindy. I would say that one of the real keys here is that people who are members of the communities that are most impacted by the things need to be doing the thinking work necessary to design the research, to do the outreach, they need to be the ones empowered to do the work, okay? Because if not, there's going to be a lot of missing pieces. So if you are a member, if you are somebody who's doing research in a community that you don't belong to, you should see, I would invite you to imagine, to think about how can you be finding people from that community, empowering them to do your job, create opportunities for them to lead, not to work with you and to give you access to their community, but to lead. And then if we have a critical mass of that, I think we will get further. I think, because I'm still talking about what W.E.B. Du Bois was talking about in the 1800s. My research is not that different from his research over 100 years ago. At some point, we got to do it different. We cannot be doing the way research has been done. That's not the model. That's not the move, because the data tells me very clearly that we haven't been focused on the real thing. We haven't been focused on the fundamental cause, which is racism, which was declared a public health crisis in 2020, but it didn't become a public health crisis in 2020. So people who are members of these communities have a vested interest in solutions, not just documenting these disparities for the sake of promotion and tenure. But they want freedom. They want liberation. And actually, all of our liberation is tied. Nobody's free until all of us are free.
Thank you. Actually, that is a beautiful sort of last statement for such an amazing talk, given that we're at the top of the hour. Well, Dr. Sealy-Jefferson, thank you from the bottom of my heart for spending an hour with us and sharing your very soulful work. And I have no doubt that you've inspired a number of individuals to rethink how we approach our own research and how we can actually keep our moral compass aligned with the work that we actually need to do, and not the work that just is easy for us to do or the work that we always just want to do. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you all so much. Thank you. An honor.
And I hope everyone, this is the end. So everyone have a really great weekend.